Well, hello and welcome to Traveling Tuesdays. I am Dr. John DeLancey, and I am delighted that you are here watching and interacting with this next teaching. This is actually, I think, number 12 of our Traveling Tuesday series, although really the second one in this winter, January into February of 2021. So that means we continue with talking about the customs and culture of the Bible. Now, in case you missed last week, session 11, we talked about the culture of religious life and cultic practices, as well as burial customs. And today we will discuss two more aspects of biblical culture. So that's what we're heading to do today together. And again, thank you so much for joining us for this session. Let's begin with prayer, and then we'll launch right into our teaching. Lord, thank you for this day, for those gathered. Thank you that you give us minds and hearts to really absorb truth of your word and certainly understand your word in context of the customs and culture of the Bible. So open our eyes and our hearts, even to life lessons that we might learn today and apply to our walk of faith with you. We are thankful for who you are as we pray in Christ's name. Amen. Well, let's launch right into our program as we continue talking about the customs and culture of the Bible. So, once again, this is our Traveling Tuesday series, and let's start with a couple new quotes about customs and culture. David Pilch said this: "The task of interpreting the Bible, which was written by and to people living in a very different cultural context from contemporary Western society, can seem monumental. The opposite is also true. People can easily forget that studying the Bible is a type of cross cultural encounter, instead, reading their own culture assumptions into biblical texts." He's right on the mark here because we can read into the Bible our own cultural assumptions. And most of the time, if they're from a Western point of view, they are not quite lined up with the ancient Near East. Here's another quote: "Understanding the basics of the culture and what they understand the words and phrases to mean is critically important if a person is to know what the Bible teaches. When someone says he takes the Bible literally and does not look at the cultural meanings, the style of literature, what the people who wrote it would have understood the words to mean, or what the purpose was in writing, he is not taking the Bible literally. The result of not taking the Bible literally is to follow man made tradition and to lose the essence and meaning of the scriptures." Thanks to John Clayton for this insight. So, we saw this in our last session when we talk about what does it mean to live in the time of the Bible. Certainly, as you see all these aspects or themes unfold, they are certainly related. And as I mentioned earlier, last week we talked about religious life and burial customs. We also talked a little about cultic practices. But today in this session, we talk about warfare, and that implies fortification and food. So a nice blend of cultural elements that I hope will really unfold and unpack the meaning of Scripture. And of course, we'll take a look at the Scriptures to help us how to understand how people lived in the days of the Bible. So let's talk about fortifications, and I'm just going to put up a number of pictures, and this may go a little quicker than last week. But when we talk about fortifications, we're primarily talking about stone walls and a few mud brick walls. This is a wall from Gamla, actually a New Testament site that was destroyed by the Romans in 66 AD. But you can see how broad this wall really was, with a tower attached to it. The Old Testament site of Kerbet Cheyafa and the Elah Valley, incidentally, where David and Goliath fought. This is a chambered gate as well. It dates to the 11th into 10th century BC. Similarly, we have a gate most likely built by Solomon, because 1 Kings chapter 9 tells us that he refortified 3 cities, and the city of Gezer was one of them. Here we see 3 chambers on one side and 3 on the other. This is a classic Solomonic gate structure. It probably looked like this, and certainly you can see that these chambers were used for storage, for extra weaponry. All depends on the time, and of course the context and the situation. The door or the gate itself to the gate complex, and of course most think that some of these towers as a part of this gate complex were higher as well, so soldiers very well could have been positioned on top. So this is a classic 6-chamber gate. This particular one even had a drainage channel underneath, like a few others that have been found in Israel. Thanks to the archaeological illustration pictures that we have in our possession, this is maybe a good depiction of the city of Dan up north. Look how wide and high these fortification walls are with the gate complex. This is actually an outer gate and an inner gate, and of course we can still see that today. Or this model of Megiddo. This was a Canaanite city before it was an Israelite city. You can see again the walls around this tell or ancient mound with a gate complex here and here. There was also one earlier from the Middle Bronze period about in this area here. So cities were fortified, even in Jerusalem. This is a pretty good model of the city of David. Here is the spring tower that's guarding the water source of the city, and the southern part of the city of Jebus, or eventually the city of David, as David would capture it from the Jebusites in 2 Samuel 5, and eventually the temple being built here on Mount Moriah to the north of David's palace. So here we have a walled city, and of course, these walls have been found in different locations down off this eastern slope of the city of David. This water tower maybe looked like this. It was guarded by a huge tower with huge stones because the water source was really the life of the city. So, of course, you wanted to protect the water source with a tower and higher walls. And most of us know the story of Hezekiah, and many of you have actually walked through Hezekiah's tunnel, a 1,720-foot long tunnel that runs from the Gihon Spring to the south, about, like I said, about 1,700 feet down to a reservoir pool here. And of course, this was done because the Assyrians were surrounding this city. So what did Hezekiah do? He heightened the walls and built this tunnel. In fact, let's take a look at this 2 Chronicles 32 passage, because again, we're looking for context. We're looking for cultural elements related to fortification and warfare. So this is what we read. We often skip over these parts of the Bible because maybe they're not spiritually applicable, or it seems like it's just a historical mentioning of what's happening. Well, this really gives us a good hint and good insights as actually to what was happening. So this is how it reads. When Hezekiah saw that Sennacherib, he was the Assyrian king who came into reign, I think, in 705 BC. He had come, and that he intended to wage war against Jerusalem. He would of course, waged war against many other Judean cities. He consulted with his officials and military staff about blocking off the water from the springs outside the city, and they helped him. And they gathered a large group of people who blocked all the springs in the stream that flowed through the land. Why should the kings of Assyria come and find plenty of water? They said. Then he worked hard repairing all the broken sections of the wall. This is Hezekiah, and building towers on it. He built another wall outside the one and reinforced the terraces of the city of David. He also made large numbers of weapons and shields. Here again, reference to warfare. He appointed military officers over the people and assembled them before him in the square at the city gate and encouraged them with these words: Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria and the vast army with him. For there is a greater power with us than with him. With him is only the arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. And the people gained confidence from what Hezekiah, the king of Judah, said. Great words of encouragement here in the context of learning about fortification. Like this Judean city, it was first a Canaanite city, but during the days of Judah, starting with Rehoboam, the first king of the divided kingdom in 930 BC. This was a two-walled city, a pretty accurate replica with a double gate complex as well, and an outer gate and an inner gate. Here's a replica of, or a model of the gate itself right at the city of Lachish. Actually, brand new displays here, about a year old. And this is maybe what this gate looked like. Back here in the background is probably the palace area built by Rehoboam. But here, with the help of the Antiquities Department, they really help us understand what this chamber gate looked like. This also was a six-chamber gate. You can see three on this side, three on this side. This was the inner gate of the city, by the way. And again, you can just imagine these gates being very, very important to refortify and to extra fortify, because gates were typically the weakest link, if you will, of the city. So the army, in this case, the Assyrians, not only attempted to walk or break through the gate, but they built this siege ramp. You can see remnants of the siege ramp. And we read about this in Isaiah 36 and 7, when King Sennacherib himself built this siege ramp in order to take battering rams to the top and to collapse the fortification walls on top. In fact, let's take a look at this city from a drone perspective. And this might really help sort of solidify in our minds and in our imaginations what this city itself looked like and how large it was itself. The city of Lachish. So I'll turn the sound down on the video because I do comment on this. The video, by the way, is a part of our Biblical Israel by Air drone project. If you're interested, you can find this on the website. But here is the archaeological tell. It's about 33 acres, maybe 35. But it was a Canaanite city. It was destroyed by Joshua in 2 days, according to the Joshua 10 text. And here we have now the outer wall of this double Judean walled city. The inner wall here and the inner gate here is, we just missed it, the palace probably built by Rehoboam. But here is the outer gate and the inner gate. So if you were an enemy, you wanted to, of course, infiltrate the city through this gate complex. There's the palace that I just missed it again, the palace that we'll see maybe a little later. Here's the siege ramp built by Sennacherib, this Assyrian king, in 701 BC. There it is. And he took his battering ram all the way to the top to infiltrate the city here. Ah, there's the palace. I finally got it. But you can see how large this city was. It was about 30 miles south and west of Jerusalem, and Sennacherib was here. So if you dig anywhere on this site, you no doubt find some ancient ruins. Again, the double wall, and they just excavated a new part of the wall, probably a 10th century wall here built by Rehoboam, according to, I think, Second Chronicles 11. This was a couple of years ago, and they also excavated a Canaanite temple that was destroyed in the 12th century. So this is the city of Lachish. And again, fortification. Most of the time, cities were fortified. So let me take you to the British Museum because this relates to Lachish. At the British Museum, they have this relief that was found in Nineveh that preserves the attack on Lachish by Sennacherib. In fact, here's a good illustration of the tower that was built in this Judean city. Here's Judeans with little bows and arrows on top, and this big battering ram coming up the siege ramp that was found archaeologically, ready to collapse this tower complex. Here is the Judeans on, they are on the top trying to defend their city. And the Assyrians themselves wore head dresses or helmets like this, typically pointed. They also had shields. They also had sling stones. This is a typical Assyrian soldier. And here are some sling stones that were actually found here at Lachish. And on this, what is called the Taylor prism, the Sennacherib prism, Sennacherib tells us that he took 46 Judean cities. He took over 200,000 Judeans exiled back to Nineveh. And of course, he couldn't take Jerusalem, although he tried, but God intervened there. And of course, Hezekiah played a big role in heightening the walls and in building the tunnel that, like we said or saw before. So before we leave this whole idea of the Assyrians, I also want to take you to Tel Bernard, which is biblical Libnah in the Shvela or the lowlands of Judah. It's only a few miles north of Lachish, but Isaiah 37 tells us that after Sennacherib defeated Lachish by the Syrian siege ramp and all of the warfare that took place, he also attacked and destroyed Tel Bernard. I'm showing you this because this is a smaller Tel, as you can see. I actually had a chance to dig here last summer, in the summer of actually 2019. No one really dug last year in 2020, but with Dr. Chris McKinney, this particular city has been excavated. And you can see this is a live excavation, and we worked over here, and you'll see just in a moment, fortification wall. And guess what? Sling stones, one that I found lodged within the 8th century wall. So we found here gates and walls, all related to the Sennacherib siege of the city, as mentioned in Isaiah 35. Various squares have been opened in areas, I should say, and you can see that an excavation is quite extensive here. And it's a site really out of in the middle of nowhere, but yet a very important site and mentioned, of course, in the Bible. The city of Libnah. This is the territory, by the way, around Bernah or Libnah. It's the southern part of the Shvela or the lowlands. So topographically, it's always very important to see the topography of the land and how important these cities were in relationship to the natural valleys or passes that actually in this area of the Shvela went from west to east towards the hill country of Judah there to the east. So these cities were positioned strategically to guard and protect and to control these passes from the west to the coastal area that we're looking at now into the hill country to the east. So here's one of these sling stones that I actually found. right there by this 8th century wall. And here's another angle of it. So Libnah was a fortified city, but destroyed by the Assyrians. But when we talk about weaponry, we're talking about daggers from Middle Bronze, Late Bronze, Iron Age periods. And of course, when we talk about Uzziah, who was a king in the 9th century, 8th century, excuse me, he said, this is what the text tells us, for Uzziah had a well-trained army ready to go out by divisions according to their numbers as mustered by Yael, excuse me, the secretary, and Maaseah, the officer. I think I butchered that name pretty good. My apologies. Under the direction of Hananiah, one of the royal officers. The total number of family leaders over the fighting men was 2,600. Under the command, under their command was an army of over 300,000 trained men, a powerful force to support the king against the enemies. Uzziah provided, here we go, shields, spears, helmets, coats of armor, bows, sling stones for the entire army. Of course, also arrows and large stones hurled from the walls. So this gives us a good picture of warfare and fortification, and certainly as it was put into practice in the days of the Bible. More spears and daggers. This one apparently served as a hoe in peaceful times, but also a pretty formidable weapon as well. All of these have been found in Israel with lots of arrows, of course, iron arrows. But when we talk about David and Goliath, of course, we try to picture what this guy Goliath looked like. Now, from the mortuary temple of Ramses III in Medinet Habu Temple, right on the western bank of the Nile River in Luxor, this gives us a good illustration of how the Egyptians pictured the Philistines. Now, we already saw the Assyrians had pointed helmets, but here these Philistines apparently had these kinds of helmets. It looks like feathers on top, but a well-protected helmet, and even a skirt-like garb. So could it be that Goliath maybe looked like this? This is how the Egyptians pictured a people group they called the Sea Peoples. We know them as the Philistines. The lands included the hill country, the western Shvela, the hill or the foothills, the Arava, the slopes, the Negev, the wilderness, and the Negev. I'm putting this text here of Joshua 12 up just to give you an idea of how warfare, how important it was, and how it was recorded. Like this is a list of all the conquered cities, 31 in total by Joshua. So when we read about all the kings, here's the king of Lachish. He was the Canaanite king, or Ai, or Jericho, or Gezer, or Arad. You can see all these names of cities, Megiddo, Dor, pretty much all of them were fortified. So these are cities that were destroyed or taken over by the Israelites led by a guy named Joshua. Of course, we can't not mention Jericho as a part of the fortification system or the culture of each city. Now, there's a debate whether this city at the time of Joshua was a double-walled city. Certainly, it was at some point. This is a sort of a newer, more enlightened aspect of what Jericho looked like, but certainly most would think that there was two walls when Joshua was here, an outer wall made up of a stone revetment wall and then a mud brick wall on top. Most likely there was an inner wall, but most likely there was not houses in between these two. Here's another description or a model or illustration of the walls. The red represents the mud brick wall. So guys like Dr. Brian Wood would say that this was a double-walled city, and this was a city that was surrounded by the Israelites for, remember, 7 days, and then the trumpets blew and the walls came tumbling down. This is the site today. It's about a 9 acre site. It's not very large at all, but here you can see a couple of the walls, the stone walls, here at the southern end of the Tel, and a closer look at the walls. So when we talk about Joshua 6 story, it certainly happened. Walls came tumbling down. It was most likely the mud brick wall positioned uh, on the top of this stone wall. So warfare, cities were fortified. So before we talk about food, maybe there's a life lesson in here as we sort of extract these words passed on from Moses to Joshua. And then, of course, these words we can read about in Joshua 1. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Here it is again. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. These are familiar words from Joshua chapter 1, and I hope it brings all of us encouragement as we face ourselves, the battles of life, and maybe fortified situations of life where we just don't think that we can either hold back the enemy or conquer the situation in our own strength. That's why we need God, and we need to turn to Him for everything. We speak about our nation and our churches and our individual lives, as we certainly need to look to God in all of our battles of life. So great and encouraging words here as we now transition to talk about food, and in doing so, of course, water and agricultural life. So, culturally speaking, we know that Israel was the land of plenty, the good land, the promised land. And we know, excuse me, there were seven first fruits of the land. This would be wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. When we read from Deuteronomy 8, this is what Moses said. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce, and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron, and you can dig copper out of the hills. Now, this is a big contrast to life in Egypt, for instance, which was dependent on the Nile River. But this promised land given to God's people was again a land of plenty. So we can talk about the grains, barley and wheat, as it's still grown today. Back in the day of modern times, of course, sickles were used, and I would have to think that this black and white picture is a good, maybe a good image of how they threw the wheat up, and of course, it separated the wheat and the chaff. And these threshing floors were used typically outside, of course, the city itself, outside the city gate. And this is a gentleman who, a number of decades, of course, ago, still was practicing probably something that was done in the culture of the Bible. Here are some threshing floors that have been found archaeologically and still, of course, used today by some of the local people. Of course, crushing the wheat or rolling the wheat. Some of these basaltic stones have been found. Uh, Archaeologically, this is the one that we found up north at a site called Abel Beit Makkah, and most likely used for this purpose. But Jericho, when archaeologists came, this would be Garstang in the 30s, 1930s, and Kenyon in the 1950s. Big vats of grain burned, of course, because of the city being destroyed, as mentioned in Joshua 6. But you can see that these great big storage jars were filled with grain that was burned. So grain, of course, was a staple in the agricultural life of the ancients. Here, these millstones give us an idea of how um, grain was actually crushed. The grain would be placed in this top part and then turned and turned and turned um, on or over this bottom part of the millstone, and then this would serve the purpose of crushing the grain. This grain bin has been found in Megiddo. This dates to the time of Jeroboam II. And you can see this huge storage area for grain, the steps here on the one side. There are also corresponding steps on this other side to the left of the picture. But this is a huge, probably a community grain silo, if you will. And they found actually a very impressive inscription in this silo that tells us of a servant who was named Shema, a servant of Jeroboam II. But of course, when we talk about the life of Jesus, he also used agriculture as a way to illustrate the kingdom of God. The seed being sown on the four different types of soil. And even in chapter 13 of Matthew, Jesus talks about the mustard seed. Compliments and credit to our friends at SourceFlix. Watch this particular video about the mustard seed. Again, we're talking about fruits and grains, and certainly how these were used to illustrate the kingdom of God. Look how small that seed is. If any of you are struggling with faith, remember that the mustard seed, even as small as it was, still represented the un uh, I should say the force, the forward force of the kingdom. Nothing could hold it back. And certainly that's how it works in our lives. The kingdom of God, when it takes root, when faith takes root in our lives, even as small as we think our faith may be, it can still be used of God in mighty ways. So grapes, of course, grapes are abundant today in Israel, especially in the Shvela. And look at these huge grapes. There's, of course, different grapes for wine and table grapes. In fact, the Lachish grapes are great table grapes. But we have an illustration in Isaiah chapter 5 that talks about the vineyard and the watchtower. Now, this particular field does not look like a vineyard to me. It looks like more olive trees and a terraced area, if you will. But you get the impression that when Isaiah was writing this, watchtowers were used, of course, in these vineyards. He says, I will sing for the one I love a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug it up and cleared it of stones and planted it with the choicest vines. He built a watchtower, there it is, in it, and cut out a wine press as well. Then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. So the imagery of this watchtower and the vineyard, of course, a lot of us on the west side of the world and so distant from, of course, the world of the Bible, we may not be able to picture what this looked like. Well, here's a wine press. Would have crushed the grapes here, and the grape juice would have drained down in this lower area. Here's another one that's quite obviously one that was used for grapes with the juice running in this area, captured, of course, and uh, made for wine. Figs, also one of the other seven foods of the Bible. Fig trees, of course, are abundant. In fact, at the city of Caesarea Philippi, I always like to teach sitting underneath the fig trees. Of course, Jeremiah, the other prophet, about 100 years after Isaiah, said this: The Lord showed me two baskets of figs placed in front of the temple of the Lord. One basket had very good figs, like those that ripened early. The other basket had very bad figs. So Jeremiah used the imagery of figs in his teaching. Or how about a pomegranate, anyone? The pomegranate. The Israelis have a saying that you are as wise as a pomegranate. And if your mind is working sharply, of course, a pomegranate with all the seeds contained inside maybe represents symbolically a very wise or smart person. So the pomegranates, this is actually the picture and not a colored enhanced picture at all. This is one of the pomegranates, I believe, at a place called Katsrin from last year. But you can see how beautiful these pomegranates are. Of course, the pomegranate was the shape of a pomegranate formed into a golden bell was sewn on the hem of the high priest. Now, this is an interesting archaeological discovery because in the drainage channel that runs from the Temple Mount in Jerusalem all the way down to the Pool of Siloam, in this drainage channel, one of these bells was actually found. It's in the shape of a pomegranate. Of course, olives as well. Olives are all over the place. Olives were the staple in the diet of people who lived in the Bible. Of course, harvested in different ways and prepared. Today, the Arab ladies usually take rakes. They put a whole huge canopy or a tarp of some kind underneath the trunk of the tree, and then they shake the limbs. You sometimes using rakes as they go. They usually aren't handpicked. It just takes too much time, but they're raked down onto this tarp. The olives, of course, are prepared in different ways, and biblically, olives were not only eaten, but of course, the oil was extracted for anointing and religious purposes, and for soaps and other medicinal purposes like that. But here is a typical olive press. Here on the right, maybe is a better picture of it. An animal most likely would turn this around and around, and the outer part of the olive would be crushed. And here's another one, I believe at a place called Chorazin up in the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. After the olives were crushed, then they were placed in a bag or a basket, and then with this counterweight, the oil would be extracted this way. So literally, this would crush even more. The weight of this stone would squeeze out the olive oil into this olive press below, capturing the oil, and of course, used as I mentioned. Dates are abundant in the Jericho area of the Dead Sea area. Here's some date palms. And of course, the abundance of dates are just incredible in this area. The hot area, the dry area is very conducive for growing great dates. Now, of course, when we talk about an area like the Dead Sea where it doesn't get much rain, we need to talk about, before we close this off, about water, because as I mentioned, water was prevalent in most areas of Israel, not so prevalent in the desert area or the Negev areas of Israel, but in contrast to Egypt, which depended on the river, or Mesopotamia, which depended on rivers up there, the Tigris and Euphrates. Israel was a country known for springs and, of course, the rains that would fall in the winter months. So Israel was a land of rains from heaven and springs, like this one here in the north. The land you are entering to take over is not like the land of Egypt. Here we go. From which you have come, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot, as in a vegetable garden. But the land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. The words of Moses in Deuteronomy 11. So all over Israel, there are springs like the Sakne spring, beautiful spring to swim in, by the way. Once in a while on summer trips, we take an hour or so here to enjoy the water. This is as the back waterfalls at Engedi, and another waterfall at Engedi. Engedi is the exception. This was one of just a few springs on the west side of the Dead Sea that it still, again, flows with water all year round. When it does rain in the desert or the Negev regions, especially a flash flood stage, it could happen and look like this: the dangerous floods of the Negev and the desert. You can see here on the left the water just plummeting down off the slopes of the Judean desert. Compliments to Pharaoh Jenkins, who is now standing here, because this one road that runs on the west side of the Dead Sea can also experience flash floods. In fact, it's very dangerous. I've seen back in the 80s buses that were turned over. So you have to be very, very careful. So here he's holding a stick of how high the water can get, and it only, of course, flows just in 30 minutes, and then it's over. But it can be very dangerous and can really even wipe out the road. Usually a couple times during the year, this road is actually destroyed by flash floods. So the road's closed, and then all the traffic, of course, has to be diverted around this destructed area of the road, and usually can be fixed the next day. Here's another picture, a wider picture of this area of the Judean desert, and again, the abundance of rain when it would flood, or when it would rain. You can see the huge amounts of water flowing into this dry riverbed. Not so dry in this picture, however. So the ancient people, these Israelites, knew exactly how to capture this water, especially when it would rain hard. And this would be through the use of cisterns. The cistern is actually one at Beersheba in the excavation stage. Cisterns were plastered, and of course, in an area like Beersheba that received only about 4 to 8 inches of rain a year, you would want to capture the rain and divert it into these cisterns, and then close it up in the dark, and then you would have a great source of water for a long time. This is one of 2 First Temple cisterns here in Jerusalem, no doubt used in the days of the Judean kings. Here's one of the huge cisterns at Masada. And I think one of my pictures here from Beit Shemesh. Beit Shemesh was known for its cistern use. So again, carved out from softer limestone and then plastered, so that when water would be diverted, like from a flash flood or heavy rain, the water would not seep into the softer type of limestone. Of course, the Bible talks about and references cisterns also. Like Jeremiah, they have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and have hewn them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. A broken cistern probably would be one that was broken or cracked, and of course, not able to hold water at all. Maybe uh, the sides of the cistern were damaged in some way. We're not sure, but a reference to cisterns. This is another reference in 2 Kings 18 and Isaiah 36. Make an agreement with me by a present and come out of me and then eat. Every man of his own vine, every one of his own of his fig tree, and drink every one of the waters of his cistern. So, obviously, a plastered cistern, not broken in this case, and yet intact and able to hold water. Even Uzziah built towers in the desert, and he dug many cisterns. So, again, these references to cisterns helps us understand how they preserved water for their own use. There were also water systems like this one here at Megiddo. We walked down about 190 steps down to this ancient one. You can see the ancient steps leading down to this huge vertical shaft. This is a good illustration. I think, again, Farrell Jenkins, credit to him for this. I believe it was him. But typically these steps or stairway was used to basically obtain water that flowed down at the bottom of this vertical shaft, because the water was diverted from the spring by the digging of this horizontal tunnel that allowed water to come this far. So either you threw a bucket with a long rope on it, or in this case, this is illustrated with a stairway. We're not sure if it really did have steps here, but all the way down to the bottom. But this is the concept. So you could easily obtain water without going outside the city wall by diverting the water, blocking the water source, and of course, diverting it to this vertical shaft. Here's the vertical shaft today of the water system at Megiddo, and the horizontal tunnel that allowed water to come from the spring to the bottom of the shaft. And we already talked about Hezekiah's tunnel for the purpose of bringing water from the Gihon spring safely down to the southwestern side inside the city wall so that the Assyrians would not have water. I put this picture in. It's not mine, although I probably could dig out a picture or two from the 80s, but look how high the water is. I know many of you have stepped through this, hiked through this tunnel. It's a 1,720-foot tunnel, and typically the water is only knee deep, maybe a little higher at the beginning, but pretty much below the knee the rest of the way. Well, back before they diverted the water to the Gihon Spring, look how high it was. It was always about belt high or a little higher than belt high, and I'm sort of glad that they have diverted the water today, or else everyone would get pretty well soaked. But this is the tunnel that is mentioned in 2 Kings 20 and 2 Chronicles 32 and Isaiah 8, verse 6, the gently flowing waters of the Siloach. Again, water, a crucial, a very important part of city life, of cultural life, of living. Water sustained every city that was built in Israel. Without water, if the spring uh, went dry, well, that was the end pretty much of the city. So water was a very important, as you realize, a very important part of Israelite life. And where water flowed, where springs were located, that's typically where cities also were built. Now, Caesarea, as we bring this to a close, was the exception, because there was no water spring in this area along the Mediterranean. So what did Herod the Great do when he built this city in 22 BC? He built about a 5 or 6, some say 7-mile long aqueduct that came all the way from the Carmel Range that you see here on the right-hand side of the picture. and he brought this water on channels on top of this aqueduct that he built. So we conclude with a life lesson, because when we talk about Israel, pretty much Israel is a dry and weary land where there is no water, says the psalmist in chapter 63. At least the desert is. Other areas, of course, have springs where these cities were located, as we mentioned. But there are certainly places where water is scarce. And yet we are invited to thirst for God in the dry and barren lands of our lives, situations in life, circumstances when they become difficult and challenging, we are to seek and thirst after Jesus, the living water, for he is the only one who can quench our thirst. So, a life lesson here as we conclude this session on the customs and culture of the Bible. I hope you can join us for our next session. This would be a session on the 26th of January, or if you're listening to this or watching this on a recording, I hope that you're able to tune in to our next session that again will continue with this theme of the customs and culture of the Bible. So thank you very much for joining us, and may God bless you in every way, and may we all seek after him as a deer pants for water. May we thirst after God. Take care until next time.